Today, we're switching gears completely, and we're going to talk about geography. We're going to talk about history and how the two are together in the Potomac River. How many people here are aware of where the Arlington border begins? Okay, not too bad. The president of the Historical Society, he raised his hand, so we're all good. But I think we're going to find out why it is where it is and how it got there. And Michael Nardolilli is the man to do the job. He is the, I want to make sure I get this right. Hold on one second. I got it on my phone. Naturally, it's on my phone. Turn around. Oh. Thank you. There he is. See, you're already famous. But one of the things that's not on the screen is that today is his hat trick. This is his third time talking to the Arlington Historical Society's public event because he knows a lot of stuff that people want to hear about. So we'll work on getting you your 5-time coat like on Saturday Night Live. And thank you for that reminder. Okay, please help me welcome Michael Nardolilli.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to going through boundaries. And we'll start off with a little teaser question. How many of the 48 states, the contiguous 48 states, actually have a boundary with other states along a river? So out of the 48, how many actually have a boundary with another state that's on a river? The answer is 44. And who can name the 4 that are not? Well, of the 48 states, contiguous states, Wyoming. Utah. Utah is correct. Wyoming, Colorado, and the last one is more difficult. It's Montana, because even though it has a squiggly border, that's the Continental Divide. That's not a river. So thought I'd share that with you since we're going to be talking about our river, the Potomac River, and its role and the boundary disputes concerning where states end and where states begin. So I'd like to just point out the map here. This is the Potomac River Basin. It's 14,000 square miles, roughly the size of Switzerland. Its origin has been, oops, sorry about that. Try that again. Its origin has been determined to be what's called the Fairfax Stone out in West Virginia, and it goes 383 miles to the Chesapeake Bay. And as you can see there, it has a border on the top with Pennsylvania. Most people don't realize that 10% of the basin is actually in Pennsylvania. And then also, if you look at it, the Potomac River shares a peninsula, which is called the Northern Neck. And the other side of the Northern Neck is the Rappahannock River, which if you've ever been to Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg's on the Rappahannock River. And then we'll be talking about that and as a boundary issue. So I want to just point out the map. So what we're going to be looking at is why isn't the boundary between these states in the middle of the river? That's the usual spot where you find it. But even in this case, where it hugs one side of the river, it's not consistent. And why is it not consistent? So we're going to be exploring those questions. So this is me at the Fairfax Stone in West Virginia. There's a 4-acre state park around the boundary there. Now, this presentation is for educational purposes only. It doesn't offer professional advice. And it's my own views. So it's not attributed to my employer, which is the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, its commissioners or jurisdictions. And I'm not concerned with the use of the Potomac River. In other words, the water in the Potomac or the oysters or any of the resources of the Potomac. I'm just concerned with the boundary line. Where do we find the boundary between these jurisdictions? And I'd ask if everybody could just hold their questions to the end. I'll be around for a long time. So I'd like to start off with the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. It was approved by Congress in 1940, which is a compact of the 5 jurisdictions in the watershed: Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia, but not the United States. So my organization is an agency of all those states, but is not a federal agency, which is a good thing these days. We do not have any regulatory authority, but we have 18 or 19 scientists that work for me that study the river, and we are very influential when we release our studies and our recommendations. So we have 3 main projects that are underway now. I'll start with this picture here, which is actually Algonquian Regional Park. In 1993, there was an oil spill. There's a colonial pipeline that runs from Dallas, Texas, all the way to New York City, and it crosses the Potomac. And in Reston, there was a blowout, and all the oil came down Sugar Land Run right into the Potomac River, and it shut down the intakes for the Fairfax Water Authority for 2 weeks. And this is the cleanup operation that's there. Secondly, so we have spills that are a major problem in the Potomac, but we also have droughts. Now this picture was taken in 1965 or 1966. It was very bad drought in the Potomac. It was the lowest flow ever recorded in the Potomac River those years. And I like it because the kid is standing at Great Falls, almost like looking to see, well, where's the water? And I remember it very well. When I was 10 years old, my grandparents brought me here for the traditional trip to Washington. And I remember sitting on the edge of the bed in the hotel room and asking my grandmother, why are they showing a picture of a bunch of rocks? And that was Great Falls, and that was the water level was so low that it was just a trickle back in 1965 and 66, and it was up and down the East Coast. I remember watching baseball games in New York City, in which they would always come on, save water today or be thirsty tomorrow. So those are the 2 things we worry about: spills, and we worry about drought. So let's looking at ways that we can remedy that situation. So our organization is trying to make the water supply of the nation's capital, including Arlington, more resilient to spills and droughts. That picture there is the Jennings-Randolph Reservoir, which holds a lot of water, but it's 9 days away. So that if the water is released from Jennings-Randolph, it takes 9 days before it hits the intakes in the DC area. So Arlington and Washington, DC are the 2 most vulnerable cities in the United States to a cutoff of their water supplies for drinking, fire suppression, and hygiene. You probably may remember what happened over the 4th of July when there was a harmful algal bloom. We had a boil water alert, and literally we were 6 hours away from running out of water in Washington, D.C. and in Arlington, Virginia. But we're working on it. In December 2022, the Water Resources Development Act authorized a study of ways to make the regional water supply more resilient to droughts and contamination events. And then Congress has also appropriated $500,000 for that study. There's a 90-10 cost share by the federal government. The feasibility study is estimated to take 3 years and cost $3 million. So we hope that whatever solution comes out of that is done within my lifetime, but it'll take a while. So let's look at the next slide here. So what else are we doing? We are improving aquatic habitats. And I just want to point out there, but that's the American eel. And some of you may know its unique life story. It starts in the Sargasso Sea in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and then swims to the East Coast, comes up the rivers and streams, and it comes up into Arlington. It can be found in Arlington, the American eel. So we are looking at trying to restore mussels, freshwater mussels upstream in the Potomac River, and we are going to use the American eel as the transport device, because what the mussels do is they release all their little glochidia, their baby mussels, in a big stream that then gets sucked into the gills of the American eel. And then the eel swims upstream, and then the mussels fall off and they grow. The problem is that the Potomac River has two dams on it, dams 4 and 5, that are remnants of the old C&O Canal. And so we have actually secured money and are going forward with building eel ladders around the two dams, 4 and 5, not because we love the eels so much, but because we really think that they would be able to put mussels upstream to help purify the water. They're natural filters. And so we're building those eel ladders on dams 4 and 5. Some of you may remember, what was the date? In August of 2001, the Washington Golf and Country Club put a herbicide down and to really burn out their fairways. And then there was a big rainstorm. And that herbicide wound up going into Gulf Branch and Donaldson Run. And there were 1,000 eels that were killed by that. And most people didn't realize that they were even there. But it's a great life cycle. They come back every year. Okay. Our third project here is limiting salt use. This is a heat map that shows the salt levels in the Potomac River from 1940 to 2020. This was all done by the Washington Aqueduct, and it was all handwritten notes about what the levels were. We actually went there and we digitized all that information and we put it on this nice little chart here. So the darker the colors are the more concentrations of salt. And as you can see, it's not just in the months of the year like January and February when you expect to see salt, but all salt is now being found throughout the year because it's endemic in the environment. And so what we're trying to do is urge people to use salt wisely, especially in the winter months. We advocate using just a coffee cup full of salt on your driveway or your sidewalk, and then after you use it, to sweep it up so it doesn't go into the waterways. This is a major problem because if it continues on its current trend, you'll actually start tasting the water. You'll tasting the salt in the water. It's very expensive to remove by reverse osmosis. And then the last part is that people who are on a low sodium diet cannot drink the tap water then because it has too much sodium in it. So it's a major problem. But let's move on to borders. Okay, so the reason that we have these problems in the borders, and it took a long time for the shaking it out, are because of 3 dueling land grants. Okay, the first one you probably remember from the movie Pocahontas. Okay, there was a land grant from King James I and that encompassed Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and the successor and interest of that was the Virginia General Assembly. Well, that would have been fine and dandy, but then you have a new king comes in, and King Charles I in June 20th, 1632, has a land grant to Lord Baltimore, and that's him over there, that extends from the first fountain of the Potomac River, that means the source, along its further bank, which is the South Shore, the Virginia shore, to the bay. So the land grant to Baltimore really gives ownership of the Potomac River to Maryland, up to the shore, okay, to the South Shore. But we still have another player to talk about, and that's Lord Fairfax. And through a 1688 grant to Culpeper, the ownership of the northern neck lying between the Rappahannock and the Potomac rivers was given to Lord Fairfax. And the boundaries of the northern neck are, as I mentioned before, the Rappahannock River in the south, the Potomac River in the north, and then an imaginary line that's drawn between the first springs of the Potomac and the first springs of the Rappahannock. But the 1632 grant was also important because it set the western boundary of the state of Maryland, which is called the Deacon's Line. And that runs from the top over there, which is there it goes from the top at the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, and then goes straight down until it hits the first spring or the source of the Potomac River. So when Virginians wanted to find out how far Lord Fairfax's domain extended, they sent an expedition up the Potomac River to find it. Well, they came to Old Town and there were two choices. You could go either straight and you can go on the what's called the north branch of the Potomac River, or you could go to the south branch of the Potomac River. And they chose to go on the north branch. Now, Jim Cummins, who worked for the ICPRB, he has calculated that indeed, most of the time, the flow of the water on the north branch was greater than the flow of the water from the south branch. And that's how you usually follow a river going upstream, is you follow its flow. And so they probably made the correct determination in going the north branch, but it just so happened that their choice meant that Maryland was going to be smaller and Virginia was going to be larger. And since they were working for Virginia, that kind of made sense. So as you see in that the top of the triangle there, not the one with the red line, the little triangle, that's the current boundary of Maryland along the north branch. But if they had gone down the south branch, it would have been that red line, and they would have come up in Highland County, Virginia. And then if you draw the line all the way up to Pennsylvania, you see that's a much bigger chunk. Maryland would have been far larger. So when the surveyors got out to what they call the Fairfax Spring, they put a big rock there, and that became the Fairfax Stone. And they said, this is the source of the Potomac. Of course, Maryland disagreed with that because depending on where you put that, depends on the size of the state. So that was always a source of contention. So let's look at the land grant to Lord Fairfax. And this was a map that was done in 1736 and 37. And as I mentioned before, you have the two rivers, the Potomac and the Rappahannock. And then you have that line. See the line that goes from the top left hand down to the middle? That's what's called the Fairfax line that's drawn between the sources of both the Potomac River and the Rappahannock River. And that was set by the surveyors back in 1735 and 1736, or 36 and 37. And this map is fascinating. I've blown up this map, and you can read a lot of the current names on the map, which really surprised me. Like on that map is 4 Mile Run back in 1736, 1737. And then also it has all the names of the different tributaries of the Potomac, very, very detailed. And also it shows the name of the Potomac River above Great Falls. At one time, Potomac River only was named from Great Falls down, and it had a different name going further upstream. And I'm told that it's pronounced very similarly to the sound of a wild goose. And it goes to Cohongarota, or Cohongarota. You know, you always can hear the sound of the wild goose. But that's what was the name of the Potomac upstream. Of course, now it's all one river. But I think it's a very fascinating map. Next slide. So what happened? So in the fervor of 1776, Virginia says, okay, well, what we're really concerned about is the use of the Potomac River and free navigation. We really don't care where the boundary line is. And so they said, we're going to relinquish our claims, Lord Fairfax's claim and the Virginia General Assembly's claim, and we hold out this olive branch to Maryland. Well, Maryland didn't grab the olive branch right away, so they were still arguing about free navigation and use of the Potomac, including a topic that's much in the news today, which was tariffs. So Virginia put tariffs on goods coming from Maryland, and Maryland put tariffs on goods coming from Virginia. And under the Articles of Confederation, all of the states were sort of little sovereign countries. And everybody sort of realized that that's not a very smart thing to do. So George Washington called in commissioners from Maryland and from Virginia to Mount Vernon, and they came up with the Mount Vernon Compact of 1785. And they then agreed on the free navigation and use of the Potomac by both states. Now, they realized that there were other states involved here. And so they said, well, why don't we have another convention and we bring in more of the states in our region? And so they actually called for the Annapolis Convention, and they got more of the regional states involved. But in Annapolis, they decided, well, you know, we really should have all the colonies present. So let's have a big convention, and we'll call this the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And so you can see that the boundary disputes between Virginia and Maryland led to the foundation of our country in the Constitutional Convention. And even though it was a great thing, the boundary line still was not determined. So it left that issue unsettled. So now the two states then said, well, let's submit this to arbitration. The Blank-Jenkins Award of 1877 was the next landmark. Now, the arbitrators rejected Maryland's claim to the high water mark on the river in favor of the low water mark on the Virginia shore. And why was that? It was because Virginia had always used the river down to the low water mark, not to the high water mark. And so they had certain prescription rights. And so the arbiters said, okay, now that's good. We'll recognize Virginia's rights down to the low water mark, even though Maryland argued that the boundary should have been at the high water mark. Remember, this is the tidal Potomac, so it does change drastically by how much land you have that's riparian along the water. But they also made a great leap forward, and they said that the line would run not from all the little indentations and all the creeks and all the bays, but go from what they call one headland to the next. Headland is a part of the bay that would, part of the land that juts out into the river. So if you think of like Jones Point, that's a headland. Or if you think of like in Leesylvania State Park, there's a part of the state park that goes out into the river. That's a headland. And so they said, what we'll do is we'll run a line from headland to headland and ignore all the little indentations of the river. And so when you look at a map like this one here, you see that over here is Mason Neck. And this is actually land that's owned by the Potomac, the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority. And then down here is Leesylvania State Park. And so what you do is you have a boundary line that goes from here to here, and all of this up here, that's all Virginia waters. And then here is all Maryland waters, and that's actually part of the land of Maryland. So you can see this headland to headland creates these nice straight lines that demarcate the boundary between Maryland and Virginia. So, but even with this idea that we're going to go with the headlands now, there came a dispute on Hog Island in 1889. Both Virginia's governor and Maryland's governor contested Hog Island, which is located on the northern neck down near the Conn River, C-A-E-N. And the question was whether or not Hog Island was on the Potomac, in which case it would be Virginia, or whether it was in the Potomac, in which case it would be Maryland. So they argued about that, and they actually got the U.S. Geodetic Service to come in and say, okay, arbitrate this dispute for us, tell us who owns it. And Mr. Whiting came up with the idea that indeed it was in Virginia, that it was on the Potomac and not in the Potomac. They really should have said, well, what is it now? Right now it's under the Potomac. Hog Island does not exist anymore. They argued about it, but it was by erosion and land subsidence, it's gone. So it's not even there anymore. But it established an important dialogue between the two states. So Maryland now had a dispute with West Virginia, where the border was going to be between Maryland and West Virginia, now that West Virginia was an independent state. So the Supreme Court of the United States determined that the low water mark on the South Bank would give Maryland a uniform boundary between Virginia and West Virginia. And more importantly, they held that the Fairfax Stone was the source of the Potomac River. So they rejected Maryland's claim that that's not the source of the Potomac River. They accepted the Virginia view that that was the source of the Potomac. But they said that Maryland had a pretty good claim. And they said, but long-term acceptance of the Fairfax stone as the source, the land records, and all of the locals in the area all relied on the Fairfax stone as the source of the Potomac River. And so therefore, Maryland, you lose, and that's the source of the Potomac. They commissioned a survey called the Matthews-Nelson Survey in 1828 to try to figure out where all these headlands were. And the survey, those two gentlemen were the geologists from both states respectively, and they came up with a map that showed where all the headlands were. So then we come up to the Virginia-Maryland Boundary Commission in 1929, which then placed markers along the headland to headland route. And I took this picture of one of those markers. This is actually in Jones Point in Alexandria, and it's it's number 58 in the series of the markers along the Potomac River. But they can be found all the way down to, I think it's the Smith Lighthouse down at the entrance of the Potomac to the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, so let's see. All right, but it gets even more complicated. All right, so why is the Fairfax stone entirely in West Virginia if it's supposed to be the boundary between two states? Shouldn't it be half in Virginia or half in West Virginia and half in Maryland? But it's not. It's 100% in the state of West Virginia. And the reason for that is shown by this map here. If you look here at the bottom here, that's the Fairfax stone, right? So there's a little stream that comes out. It's called the Fairfax Spring. And they said, yes, indeed, that's the source of the Potomac. But that little spring actually goes west, and then comes back around again and forms the North Branch. So what? Oh, there you go. And so if you follow the boundary of the river, which is supposed to be the boundary line between Maryland and Virginia, or West Virginia, and you follow that to where it intersects that line, going all the way up to the state of Pennsylvania. Where it intersects that line is not here, but it's up here, because it goes around in a circle. And so they said, that's actually the border between Maryland and West Virginia. And so they put this monument, which is called Monument Number 1, at that spot. So it's kind of ironic is that when you go out to Fairfax Stone, you think you're going to see boundaries, but you don't. It actually is further downstream from that. So it's a little quirk. But there's another thing about this map, in that, see this little stream here? That's called the Potomac Spring. That was one of the arguments that Maryland used. And they said, no, if you're trying to find the source of the Potomac, follow that little spring. And you see this little dot there? They put a big stone there called Potomac Stone. And they said, that's the source, not the Fairfax Stone. Well, they lost, but that was the basis of their argument. And if that was true, they would have gotten about a mile and a half of more territory for the state of Maryland. But as it was, Fairfax Stone prevailed. Okay, now we get into some legal issues. State boundaries along rivers are usually in the middle of the river, right? So if it's in the center of the river does change, of course, with accretion and erosion and things like that. And the general rule is that the river, even though it changes course gradually, the boundary line, is also changing gradually because it's following the river. It's not the same as if there's a big flood. If there's a big flood and the river changes course dramatically, then it's the old boundary is still the boundary. So you have these two competing things about a flood versus a gradual change. And also, if you have a situation like we have, which is the Potomac River is not, the boundary of the Potomac River is not in the middle, but it's on one shore, then you have another rule, which is that it can be either fixed or it can be shifting, depending on the origin of the boundary itself. And so there are a couple of cases involving the Ohio, And that also involved Virginia because Virginia had to gave up its rights to the Ohio River in 1792, where the Supreme Court said that was a fixed boundary. That was a fixed boundary because that's what everybody wanted it to be. It was a fixed boundary. Well, with the Potomac, was that true? Is it a fixed boundary or is it a shifting boundary that will change if you have gradual accretions or erosion? And so that was squarely before a Maryland court and I'll bring that slide up. And it was near Harper's Ferry. But the dispute concerned this little Potomac wayside here, which was an accretion of land that was about 150 feet wide. The Maryland landowner on this side said that the boundary of the river was set. And so therefore, that's my property, even though now it's come out of the river by accretion, that's my property. And a little outfitter who wanted to cross that land was trespassing. They wanted access to the river to go tubing and things like that. So the issue was joined, and so the court had to decide. The court had to decide, you know, who was right. Was the Potomac a shifting boundary line, or was it fixed? And so they decided that, looking at the history of the boundaries, that indeed it was a shifting boundary. So that meant that that land that was accreted there onto the Virginia side was in Virginia. And even though the landowner who owned the land in Maryland sued in a Maryland court, the court did not have any jurisdiction because it was a Maryland court and could not have jurisdiction over the land in Virginia. So the landowner lost. But it set a very important precedent that the river was a shifting boundary river. So now let's move down further and we get closer to our neck of the woods here. Let's go. Okay, here we are. The DC Virginia boundary. Now, many of you have seen this before. These are the 40 boundary stones around the original District of Columbia. So the creation of DC created a lot of issues because both Maryland and Virginia gave up their rights. And so DC had ownership on both sides of the river, including the riverbed. Okay. So in 1847, you have the Act of Retrocession, which means that the Virginia portion of DC was returned to Virginia. But where was the new boundary? Now, remember what I said before, Virginia had certain prescriptive rights against Maryland, and that's why the boundary was not at the high water mark, but rather the low water mark. Well, the courts over the years have said, well, no, that does not apply to DC because DC owned both sides of the river at one point, and that extinguished the prescriptive rights of Virginia in that portion of the river that was between in the DC area. So the boundary between DC and Virginia, north of Jones Point and south of Little Falls, would be the high water mark. Remember I said upstream it was the low water mark. This is the high water mark along the Virginia shoreline. And then it becomes even more complicated because now we have to look at the shifting boundary issue. Silt was coming down the river and that altered the shoreline. And then dredging operations also altered the shoreline and created new islands. So where were those islands? So here I am on what's called the Little River. This is the spit of the Potomac River that runs between Teddy Roosevelt Island and the Virginia shore. So literally I'm standing on the boundary line for Virginia right at that spot. But it was called Analoston's Island or Mason's Island. It was owned by Maryland. It was transferred to DC in 1791. And they built a causeway there, which then cut off the flow of the water between Teddy Roosevelt Island and Virginia, and it started to fill up with silt, actually creating a land bridge between Virginia and Teddy Roosevelt Island. So now if it continues to do that, then you've got a good claim that Virginia owns Teddy Roosevelt Island. But the federal government had always maintained that that island was part of DC, and actually had stationed troops there during the war. And there was a ferry that ran between Georgetown and Teddy Roosevelt Island. So therefore, they had a good claim to Teddy Roosevelt Island. Now the causeway itself was removed, and now there's a bridge that goes there instead, and the Little River flows once again. somewhat confusing because there is a little river out at Aldie, Virginia, but this is also called the Little River. So how about Alexander's Island, going further downstream? In this little map here, you see on the top here, you see Mason's Island. If you go down further downstream, you come to Alexander's Island. This area today is the Pentagon Connector parking lot. But it was once known as DC's Alexander's Island. So it's an island in the Potomac. It was DC. But there was a narrow channel that then silted up naturally, and then it became Jackson City, which probably some of you know was a lawless haven for gamblers for many years. Now, the Virginia officials cracked down on the gambling, but DC didn't contest jurisdiction. So Virginia got more and more involved with Alexander's Island. Virginia got more and more involved. But it was still kind of odd in that at high tide, it was an island, which would meant that it was part of DC. And then at low tide, there was a land bridge that connected to Virginia, which would meant that it was part of Virginia. So where really was the boundary for Alexander's Island? And of course, a lot of this has been changed by the building of the Pentagon and the filling in of the water. So now we come to Columbia Island. So Columbia Island was also from the mudflats that were owned by DC, dumping, dredging and fill dirt and rock, created new land, okay? And this island was created as part of the Arlington Memorial Bridge project. And there was a digging of a aptly named boundary channel to protect the bridge piers from the floods. But was this new island part of DC or part of Virginia? Another question. So now we go even further downstream and we come to National Airport. Airport construction near Gravelly Point. These mudflats were also once part of DC. Dredged materials were dumped there, converting a portion of the Potomac River into dry land, so that the locations below the low water mark now became land above the high water mark. The airport opened in 1941, and of course now it's known as Reagan-Washington National Airport. But was the new airport in DC or Virginia? Another question. Well, let's continue downstream to go to Alexandria. Now, Alexandria landowners for many years were extending their property piers far out in the Potomac River. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers surveyed the edge of the waterfront improvements along the Potomac, and they came up with what they called the pierhead line on the Alexandria stretch of the riverfront. Is that the boundary? And actually, the folks, the riparian owners of land along that stretch of the Potomac in Alexandria had a very good case, because when they owned the land, under Maryland law, they could build these piers far out into the river. And so that was the basis of their claim. And I'm not going to get into the legal disputes between landowners there and the federal government, but just to say is that it was an issue about where the boundary was. Okay. So now that we have the dispute, we have to have a solution. And so Congress gets involved. So in 1934, Congress created a 3-person DC Virginia Boundary Commission. As you see, there's a lot of boundary commissions in the history of the Potomac River. And it had a presidential appointee, an appointee from the Virginia governor, and then the two of them selected the 3rd member of the commission. Well, they caused quite a kerfuffle when they came up with the recommendation that it would be the present-day low water mark that would be the boundary. Well, that would give a lot of land to Virginia, and that was pushed back by the National Capital Planning Commission, who didn't like it. And so there was a big dispute over a long period of time. And then they finally said, okay, let's have hearings and let's settle this issue. So what they did was Congress then passed a statute that set a winding boundary at the present day high water mark and empowered the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey to place what they call 15 witness marks on the DC-Virginia boundary line. And that website there actually is very, very detailed, and you can track and go down and look at where all these 15 witness marks are along the boundary between DC and Virginia. So it's a great great source of information. Let's see. Okay, so let's look at one of these so-called witness marks. And that is the boundary on DC and Arlington boundary, which is on the Route 50 bridge over the GW Parkway. This is witness mark number 6. So there you can see what it looks like here. It's this little disc, and as you see, it says witness mark number 6, 1945, and it's embedded in the concrete on the bridge. So if you are going from Alexandria and you're going north on a GW Parkway and you go out the exit to go Route 50 west, you come across this kind of a strange bridge. And the bridge is very wide, but the asphalt is very narrow. And the rest of the bridge is just grass. I mean, it's just an odd bridge. If you've ever been over it, you probably would remember it. And that's where one of the boundary marks are. That's the witness mark there, witness mark number 6. So Congress passed Public Law 208, which then had this gigantic run-on sentence to describe the boundary between DC and Virginia. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but instead I'm going to break it down into particular chunks. I'm going to look at the northern part, the boundary channel, the pierhead line, and then finally the shifting theory. So bear with me. So as we look upstream, because here's Chain Bridge up here, and this is the boundary of the District of Columbia up there. So said boundary line shall begin at a point where the northwest boundary of the District of Columbia intercepts the high water mark. There it is again, the high water mark on the Virginia shore of the Potomac River, and following the present mean high water mark, thence in a southeasterly direction along the Virginia shore of the Potomac River to Little River. So here we are up here, and it comes all the way down to here where we get into the Little River. And you see that's the boundary line that's on the Virginia shore. So that water and the island itself, Teddy Roosevelt Island, is in the District of Columbia. So let's continue. So the boundary line continues along the Virginia shore of the Little River to the boundary channel. And that's the boundary channel here. And you see the little dotted line. That's the boundary between the state and Virginia and DC. And so that follows the boundary channel. And then it comes into this lagoon here. And then it kind of goes back to the river and then continues south. So meaning that the Columbia Island is in the District of Columbia. So to the main body of the Potomac River, along the Virginia side of the Potomac River, across the mouths of all tributaries affected by the tides of the river. And that means you get down to National Airport. And right here, you see it goes in a little, but then it continues down along here, meaning that the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport is in Virginia. So if we go down further, it says the line continues to 2nd Street in Alexandria, Virginia, and then from 2nd Street to the present established pierhead line, and following the said pierhead line to its connection with the District of Columbia, Maryland boundary line. So here we are. It comes down here this way, all the way past the pierhead line to Jones Point, which is here. Now remember before I said about the headland to headland. Well, here it is. This is Jones Point, and you go all the way down here to River Farm, and that's the other headland. And so it goes from here to here. So all of this on this side is in Virginia, and then all of this is in Maryland. But the important point is shown by this diagram over here, in that you have the line coming down from, and there's a little shack there, a 1942 shack, which is recorded here. There you go. Okay, and as you see, it comes down, and this is 2nd Street up here. So it comes all the way down, and then goes out into the Potomac River, and then joins the pierhead line. So it comes down straight here, and then goes this way and joins the pierhead line near Alexandria. So that's another little quirk of the boundary line between DC and Virginia. But the last part is what do we do about the shifting boundaries? So Congress thought about that. And they said that whenever said mean high water mark on the Virginia shore is altered by artificial fills and evacuations, and it says made by the United States, not Virginia, made by the United States, or by alluvion or erosion, then the boundary shall follow the new mean high water mark on the Virginia shore as altered, or whenever the location of the pier headline along the Alexandria waterfront is altered, then the boundary shall follow the new location of the pier headline, which we talked about down here in Alexandria. So it encapsulates the shifting boundary theory in that even though that these are well-known markings that was in the statute, the boundary line still could change if the river gradually changed, not by flood, but by accretion or erosion. So summarizing it, so south of Jones Point, you have the low water mark on the Virginia shoreline. In the middle part of the river, you have the high water mark on the Virginia shoreline. And then north of Little Falls, you have the low water mark on the West Virginia shore. Keeping in mind that, again, south of Jones Point, you have these headland to headland markings. And then also in the middle part of the river, you have a statute that actually defines where the boundaries are. And then north of Little Falls, it's clearly the old rule. It follows the low water mark on the West Virginia shore. So now, there is a Roman holiday called Terminalia, which is in honor of the Roman god of boundary stones. I bet you didn't know that there was a Roman god of boundary stones. And so every year on February 23rd, the Romans would gather around their boundary stones and they would put like garland and sing songs and dance and all that stuff. Very important in the Roman life of where the boundary stones were. So their feast day was called Terminalia. And so what I'm thinking is that next year on February 23rd, 2026, I will be down at Jones Point and I will celebrate Terminalia down there at Jones Point. And the reason for that is that you have 3 boundary stones. You have here in front of the lighthouse, you have the original you have the south boundary stone of the 40 stones that were around the original boundary of the District of Columbia. Then you have this guy here, which is one of the 58 boundary markers that I told you about, and I had the little picture of the disc, and that's right there. And then if you walk about 15 feet more up, you'll see that guy in the woods there, and that is one of the witness marks. So you have these 3 boundary markers. The boundary mark, that's boundary marker number 14 of the witness boundary line. And then you have 58 from the Maryland Boundary Commission. And then finally you have our old favorite, the south boundary stone of the District of Columbia, located right near the Jones Point Lighthouse. So that's where I'm going to be next year. I hope you can join me. So anyway, so this is me. I'm in front of one of the really key gauges on the Potomac River. This is at Point of Rocks. That gauge has been recording the flow of the Potomac River for over 130 years. So we have a great deal of data going back a long, long time. And I just want to point out is that we're still in a drought. It's going to rain tomorrow, but we're in a drought. We've been in drought since 2023. So if you come away with anything from this lecture, just know that you should use water wisely. It may be a very dry summer, and we may be very pressed for our precious resource, and that's water. So if anybody wants more information about this, I have a 4-part series that I posted on LinkedIn, which is Who Owns the Potomac? And you can learn more about that than you ever want to learn about the boundary along the Potomac River. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and then open it up for any questions. Oh, thank you. Yes.
Where the sign says, "Welcome to Washington, D.C." If the boundaries are shifted,
Well, no, yeah, oh yeah, I gotta repeat the question for the people online here. The question was, there's a sign in Roslyn that says, "Welcome to Washington DC," and it is clearly in Virginia. And there is a marker someplace very close to that, which was put there it was one of the witness markers. I don't know where that is in relation to that particular stone that says, "Welcome to Washington DC," but it's around there. So, yes, sir.
Where does your funding for the organization come from?
Very good question. We have 5 signatory jurisdictions that support us, and so they each contribute. The federal government is also supposed to contribute, but it's a hit or miss thing from the federal government. But what we do is we get grants from the various states to study the Potomac River and things like harmful algal blooms and things like that. So we have a lot of grants that come to us through the states and some from the federal government to support our work. And like I said, most of it is scientific research that's supported.
What was the very first event that got you involved?
Oh, yes. What was the very first event that got me involved with all of this? Probably thinking back, I was formerly with the C&O Canal Trust, and that's really where I first then started wondering what's the boundary of the Potomac River going upstream? So yes, that was a while back. Yes.
Could you please explain the difference between on the river and in the river?
Okay, all right, so if you can just imagine that, the question is, what is the difference between being on the river and in the river? So if you look at an island, that's clearly in the river, okay? But if there's a part of an island that looks like it's connected to the land, and maybe it's only connected to the land at certain flow rates, then it's sort of like, well, it's sort of like in Virginia, isn't it? And so that's the difference between being in the river, which is clearly Maryland, and being on the river, like a restaurant being on the river. It's not in the river, it's on the river. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was curious, for those of us that sail on the Potomac River inside the Beltway, we noticed that, I mean, from everything you've told us, it seems like Maryland should be enforcing the laws of the waters on this side of the Wilson Bridge, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Is there some other kind of jurisdictional the handshake that says that the district controls enforcing the sort of the laws of the waterway?
Right. So if you look at the boundary line there, you'll see there's the Beltway, and then there's a line that goes across that says District of Columbia, Maryland. That's the line. That's the boundary between District of Columbia and Maryland. So that little portion of the river there that's north of that line is the jurisdiction of District of Columbia, and then south of that would be the jurisdiction of Maryland. But there have been a lot of disputes. Some of you may remember the Air Florida disaster when the plane hit the bridge. Well, the first responders to that site were the Arlington first responders. Well, when the folks from DC got there, they kicked them off the bridge, and they said, "This is our bridge, it's in our jurisdiction." And there have been examples of people who have been in distress on the river, and then it was like, well, who do you call? Is it Montgomery County jurisdiction? Is it Virginia? And you get those questions that come out. So it has it's a living problem. And then leaving aside the fact that it wasn't until Congress decided this in 1945, there were a lot of accidents on Columbia Island. And the question is, well, who had jurisdiction of that? So, you know, it was a mess. But no, a very good point. There are a lot of hypotheticals that you can think of as who's actually responsible. Yes.
Mike, thank you very much. Very fascinating. Two questions. One question. Back in the day, it used to be that some of the Virginia jurisdictions, entrepreneurs would build out into the Maryland waterways with a bridge or whatever. Then they carry on all sorts of hanky things that were allowed in Virginia or in Maryland, but not in Virginia. That's one. And the other one is following up on this gentleman's question. What does a fisherman do? Does he have a license in Virginia or Maryland? And how the devil can he figure out which side he's on, or she can figure out which side he's on?
Well, there is another commission that looks into those issues. That's the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. And so they're based in Colonial Beach. And so I would direct that question to them on the fisheries side. On your other question was exactly right. If you go down to Lee Sylvania State Park, there's a long pier that goes out into the river, and you walk out on that pier, and then midway through it, you see a little boundary between Virginia and Maryland. And so, yeah, you actually cross into the jurisdiction. Actually cross into the jurisdiction. So if one jurisdiction allows gambling and the other doesn't, that's why they did it. And so my feeling is that there probably are agreements among the law enforcement community about such things now. But yeah, you're absolutely right. If you go out far enough on a lot of these piers, you're actually in a different state. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the vulnerability to DC and Arlington water. Does that also apply to Fairfax County, or are they separate from that?
Well, say that again.
You mentioned the vulnerability of drought for Arlington and DC. Does that also apply to Fairfax?
So the question is the vulnerability of DC and Arlington to cut off of the drinking water supplies. Does that also apply to Fairfax? And the answer is yes, it does, but not as severe. Fairfax has the Occoquan Reservoir as a backup. The jurisdictions in Maryland have the Patuxent River reservoirs as a backup, which are very close. The only source of water for DC and in Arlington would be those small little reservoirs that you see along MacArthur Boulevard. Otherwise, you have to have a release from Seneca, which is in Black Hill Regional Park. And then further upstream, 9 days away, is the Jennings Randolph. And so as someone who is empowered to request releases of water from the Jennings Randolph Reservoir, one of the things that keeps me up at night is what happens if it gets very dry. And then I look at the weather reports, and weather reports are extremely variable 9 to 10 days out. And so therefore I would make a recommendation that they release water, and then 5 days later it rains. And so I've shot my load. So that's my worry. I'm hoping that this study that comes out will come out with making the area water supply more resilient. And I'll just say what my personal feeling is that there is a quarry, an ongoing quarry in Potomac, Maryland, that would be ideal for this purpose. And that could be filled by water from the river, by pumps, and then by gravity, connect it right to the system. And so you wouldn't even have to use the Potomac River as the delivery mechanism. You would go right into the system. So I hope they come up with that recommendation, because then we have to fund it.
Mentioned a couple times now, 9 days, and it's that could flow of water.
Yeah, that's the flow of the river. So when you have the Jennings Randolph is located really close to the source of the Potomac. And so if the water is released there, it takes 9 days to flow down through the Paw Bends and all that stuff, all the way down to the intakes, which are located around the Washington, D.C. area. So that's the 9 days. But no.
Any disputes that came up where the boundary is on the bottom of the river?
Excuse me?
There have been any disputes as to where the boundary is on the bottom of the river? Say you want to dredge up something or find something
That is a good question. I don't know. There have been LiDAR studies of the bottom of the river to try to identify, shipwrecks and other things that may be down there that could be valuable. But I'm not aware of any disputes about treasures that may be under the water. But how much time?
We have questions.
Yeah.
Anytime we have questions online.
Oh, okay.
From Marty. Marty?
Hi,
Marty?
Michael. Yeah, we've got several questions. We normally, people in the Zoom world, stay quiet, but you've inspired them. So let me start with one. This one, I think you've had some images in your presentation. I heard that Roosevelt Island and Columbia Island were once connected, but dredging for material to build the Pentagon separated them. Is that correct?
I have seen maps indicating that they were kissing cousins. I don't know if you could actually walk from one to the other, but they were very, very close to each other at one point, and that they did do dredging in order to try to separate them to allow the water to flow more freely so that it wouldn't, so in a flood situation, it wouldn't harm the bridges.
Okay. Also, a couple of people, they had difficulty seeing when you were navigating on some of these maps, and they were wondering if you would be able to share your PowerPoint. We have to figure out a mechanism to do that, but would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, well, I don't have to repeat the question since everybody online has heard it. Yes, actually, the Arlington Historical Society has a copy of my PowerPoint and they can share it.
Okay, great, thank you. Now I'm going to sort through some of these other ones. Wait a minute, they're still coming in. Uh, Here's one that says, so with the Maryland boundary extending to the shore of Virginia, what organization enforces the low flow Potomac Agreement on maintaining river flows during drought?
Okay. Well, I wonder if that's someone from my organization. So there is what's called the low flow allocation agreement that was signed back in the 70s. And that empowers my organization to do studies and to predict. And every 5 years, we do a study about water supply and demand. And that actually, we will have the annual meeting of the low flow allocation agreement in April later on. And the whole purpose there is that everybody gets together and compares notes. And if we are in a situation where the river has dropped to a very, very low level, then you're looking at I guess the water czar of Washington, D.C. right here, because then I've got to make a recommendation on who gets water and who doesn't. And then there's a mediator or a moderator that looks over my shoulder. So there's a whole process that's set up for that situation. And I should add that there's another agreement called the Water Supply Coordination Agreement, which is designed so that the low flow allocation agreement is never triggered, and it has never been triggered. And I want to keep it that way, so that basically we get involved and actually make recommendations for different water suppliers to get off the Potomac River. So for Fairfax County, for example, if we got to a low situation, we'd say, don't take water from the Potomac, take it from the Occoquan Reservoir, or from the standpoint of the WSSC, don't take water from the Potomac, but take it from the Patuxent reservoirs. And also for the Army Corps of Engineers, don't take water from either Little Falls or Great Falls, depending on where we would want more water. So there are things you can do, and as well as we work with COG, and COG is the one that issues these drought warnings, and they would be the ones that actually would work with the local governments to start conserving water on a region-wide basis.
Okay, thank you. And another one, there's all, these get to be pretty precise. So if the boundary is the high water mark south of Alexandria, if I understood you, with the rising of the river, it seems like Virginia is losing a lot of territory. Is that the case?
Well, no, the river boundaries will move, right? And so that's one possibility, yes.
Okay. Here's an easy one. These other ones get harder. What is the status of the proposed Arlington Marina?
The Arlington Marina or the boathouse?
I'm not sure. The person did. That's
So
all I got. I don't know.
I know that Paul
don't know
Holland used to be the guy I would go to with a question on that like that, but Paul Holland now is in New Zealand for a couple of years, so I don't know what the status of the boathouse is.
Okay. All right. Where is the first drinking water intake located on the Potomac River?
Well, if I had to disclose that, I would have to kill you.
Don't kill me. Kill the person who's asking.
No, we always refer to the general area where the intakes are, basically around Washington DC, going north on the river. And that's the intakes for WSSC, for Fairfax Water, and for the Arlington and DC water. It gets it from there. But I can't disclose that. And if you go on Google Maps, and matter of fact, you'll see that whole area is blotted out because we don't want to give a roadmap to terrorists. Because what I was saying before about contamination events, it's not just accidental events that we are concerned about. It's the T word. And so we want to make sure that we don't give anybody more information than they already have.
That's a great explanation. And then the last question I have is, what is the name of the second agreement and details on the April meeting? I'm not sure. Is that?
That's the low flow allocation agreement.
Okay.
Back to questions here.
Yes.
Your map number 3, you're describing your lines that go from headland to headland. Yes, that was.
Yeah.
But I see it's not a straight line from Jones Point to headland south of there. You've got a dog leg in there.
Well, that I don't know whether or not that was. Oops. Maybe that was an old island that has simply disappeared from the river. But you're right. There's a little dog leg here, but it's basically a straight line down from Jones Point down to River Farm, and that's headland to headland. But it could have a little jog in it where they put they put some sort of marker at one point because that was a piece of dry land that maybe it's not a piece of dry land anymore. So it does change like Hog Island. It just could have disappeared.
Hey, Michael, for those in Zoom land, we don't see where you're pointing. If you can just kind of describe exactly where that is on the.
Okay, yeah. If you south of Alexandria, where the Beltway crosses the river, that's Jones Point. And Jones Point then has one of these markers, is a headland. And then if you go due south from that point, you hit the shore of Virginia at a place called River Farm. And that's the headland to headland. And the question was, what about this little jog that's in the middle of the river there? And I was just guessing that maybe it was once an island that's no longer there.
Back to the audience.
Oh, yes.
I love your idea of the terminal area at Jones Point, whatever you call it. I'm from Alexandria, and I've been active in the Alexandria Historical Society. So I thought I'd just throw out the idea of having a joint meeting down there of the two societies who both have AHS in their name. I have to admit that yours is number 1. Historically, believe it or not, to Alexandria.
I did not pay him to say that, but thank you very much.
Jones Point Lighthouse, has it been in horrible condition?
Yeah.
My understanding, and I have to check this out, of course, the National Park Service right now is in chaos.
Yes.
So the city of Alexandria, I understand, has appropriated money to fix it up. And I have to see what the timing is, but that might be a good time to celebrate the fixing up of Jones Point Lighthouse. And also maybe our two societies can do something jointly.
Okay, no, I accept the challenge. So I think that's a very good idea. And I also want to point out, though, that at Jones Point, you see in this picture here that there are 4 stones that you can see, right? The one in the foreground is actually a marker. The other one is an identification that says who owns the Potomac, ironically enough. And it's just a description of this dispute. And the other 2 stones were where you draw lines that came in. You know what I mean? They're really not significant at all, but they just seem to pop up on Jones Point. Yes, sir.
Curiosity. Of Cumberland, there are places where the Potomac River
Really, squiggly? How does the boundary follow that?
It does follow that. That's especially at what's called Paw Bends. And the Paw Bends, yeah, it goes very much like that. And it follows the river that way. When the C&O Canal got to that point, they said, enough of this, we're gonna go right through the mountain. Down at the Paw Bends. Yes, sir.
Not a question, but just FYI, in World War I, German and Austro-Hungarian citizens were banned from DC because the boundary line, the precursor to the FBI, guarded the bridges and arrested anybody they thought might be German or Austro-Hungarian that walked onto the bridge on the Virginia side. Because as soon as they got on the bridge, they were entering the district where they were banned.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was at least one case they arrested a guy and he was released because he was Swiss.
A lot of interesting stories. So,
Okay, anybody else? Anybody else online?
No, we're good.